The weekly reset isn't a discipline failure. It's a reward. Your brain isn't breaking down on Thursday because you lack willpower. It's breaking down because it already got what it came for on Sunday night before you did a single thing. That feeling you get when you write the plan, set the wake-up time, decide this week is different, that's not motivation. That's the payoff. And your brain has learned across dozens of repetitions that Sunday evening plus the recommitment ritual equals that feeling. So it keeps running the cycle. Not because you're weak, because the loop is working exactly as designed. The problem isn't that you keep resetting. The problem is that your system was accidentally built to make the reset feel better than the follow-through. You've read Atomic Habits. You know about habit loops. You understand intellectually that systems matter more than motivation. And you watched yourself do the Sunday reset again last week anyway, maybe while reading one of those books. That's not an intelligence problem. That's a reward problem. And it has a specific structural fix, not a mindset shift, not a harder commitment on Sunday night, a design change. 3 of them in sequence. Here's exactly what's happening inside the loop and how to break it. To understand why the reset cycle is so durable, you need to understand what Charles Duhigg found when he spent years researching how habits actually form at the neurological level. In The Power of Habit, Duhigg draws on research from MIT's Anne Graybiel lab, studying how habits encode in the brain. What the researchers found was that habit formation isn't about repetition alone. It's about a specific 3-part loop: cue, routine, reward. The cue triggers the behavior. The routine is the behavior itself. The reward is what the brain receives at the end. And here is the finding that changes everything. The reward is not a bonus. The reward is the engine. The brain encodes the loop specifically because of the reward, and it keeps running the loop automatically to get back to that reward. The cue and the routine are just the path to the thing the brain is actually chasing. Duhigg goes further. He explains that once a habit loop is established, the brain stops actively participating in the routine. The behavior gets chunked, handed off to the basal ganglia, which runs it automatically without requiring conscious decision-making. This is what makes habits efficient. You don't have to decide to brush your teeth every morning. The loop runs and the behavior happens. The brain conserves its resources for things that actually require thought. Now here is where this applies directly to the Sunday reset, and this is a synthesis, a connection Duhigg doesn't make explicitly, but one that follows directly from his framework. The reset cycle has a cue, the end of the week, the natural boundary, the moment when the previous chapter closes and the next one hasn't started. For most people who run this pattern, it arrives on Sunday evening with a specific feeling, the week ending, the slate not yet written. The routine is the recommitment, the plan, the list, the decision that this time will be different. The journaling, the scheduling, the serious conversation with yourself about what needs to change. And the reward is the clean slate, the feeling of hope and resolution that arrives before any work has been done. The specific neurological relief of a problem that felt intractable suddenly feeling solvable again. The version of yourself who is about to get after it. That version feels real on Sunday night. That feeling is the payoff. And that payoff is completely real. It lands in your body. Your brain registers it the same way it registers any other reward: food, connection, accomplishment. It doesn't care that no work happened yet. It got what it was chasing. Which means the loop is going to run again next Sunday, not because you lack discipline, because your brain learned across dozens of repetitions that Sunday evening plus the recommitment ritual equals the reward of the clean slate. That association is now encoded. The loop runs automatically. Here's the part that makes the whole thing worse. The harder you try using the same approach, the more you feed the loop. A more serious Sunday planning session, a more detailed list, a more committed feeling going into Monday. All of that is a more intense version of the routine, which delivers a more intense version of the reward, which makes the loop more deeply encoded. You are not fighting the cycle when you try harder on Sunday. You are training it. This is why rereading Atomic Habits and deciding to take it more seriously this time produces the same result. The problem isn't your understanding of the material. The problem is that the reward in your habit loop is attached to the act of deciding, not the act of doing. Until that changes, the loop doesn't change. There's a second structural failure sitting underneath the reward problem, and it explains something specific about the timing of the collapse, not why it happens, but why it almost always happens midweek rather than Monday or Tuesday. B.J. Fogg is a behavior scientist who spent more than 2 decades at Stanford studying what actually makes behavior change work. His book, Tiny Habits, is built around what he calls the behavior model, a formulation he arrived at after years of watching well-intentioned behavior change attempts fail in predictable ways. Fogg's model is this: behavior happens when 3 things converge at the same moment: motivation, ability, and a prompt. All 3. Not 2 of the 3. All 3. If motivation is present but ability is too low, the behavior doesn't happen. If the prompt arrives but motivation has dropped, the behavior doesn't happen. The model isn't about maximizing one variable, it's about engineering the convergence of all 3. The insight that matters most for the reset cycle is what Fogg says about motivation specifically. He argues, and this is coming from a man who built an entire academic career studying persuasion and motivation, that motivation is the least reliable variable in the model. It fluctuates. It spikes and crashes on a timeline you don't control. Designing a behavior change system that requires high motivation to sustain is designing a system that will fail every time motivation drops to its normal level. Now look at what happens on Sunday night. Motivation is at its weekly peak. The clean slate reward has just landed. The resolve is real. The list goes on the paper and the list includes everything, because at peak motivation, everything feels manageable. The workout, the diet, the morning routine, the no phone rule after 9 p.m., the reading, the cold shower, the work project you've been avoiding, the full system reboot. And on Monday morning, ability is whatever it normally is. Not elevated, not suddenly higher because of the Sunday plan, the same as it always is. Which means the full system the viewer just committed to requires high motivation to execute, and high motivation was only available Sunday night. Monday works because the motivation spike hasn't fully dissipated. Tuesday works for the same reason, or close to it. Wednesday is where the math stops working. Motivation has returned to baseline. Ability has not increased. The full system now requires more motivational fuel than is available. One thing gets skipped, then another. The system starts showing holes. And here is the specific mechanism Fogg's model reveals. A behavior system that requires high motivation to sustain doesn't fail gradually, it collapses. Because once ability and motivation stop converging with the prompts, the behaviors stop happening, not one at a time in a manageable way, but in a cascade. The workout goes. Then the diet goes, because what's the point if the workout is already gone? Then the morning routine goes. By Thursday, the system has enough holes that it no longer feels like a modified version of the plan. It feels like a failed version of it. And a failed system in progress is psychologically worse than a failed system that can be cleanly reset, which is exactly why the reset becomes attractive again. Not because you're weak, because you are responding rationally to a structural failure that makes the reset feel like the most sensible available option. Fogg makes a point that is worth sitting with here. He says that when people fail at behavior change, they almost universally blame themselves. They conclude that they lack discipline or willpower or commitment. He argues that this conclusion is almost always wrong. The problem is the design. A behavior system built for peak motivation will fail every single time motivation returns to normal, regardless of who is running it. The failure is in the architecture, not the person. You've been blaming yourself for an architectural problem. That's not just inaccurate, it's been actively making things worse because the self-blame narrative is part of what makes the Sunday reset feel necessary and legitimate. James Clear's argument in Atomic Habits is one of the most useful frameworks in the behavior change literature, and it has a specific failure mode that matters enormously for the reset cycle. Clear's claim is that the most durable behavior change is identity-based, not outcome-based. I want to lose 20 pounds. Not process-based. I will work out 4 times a week. Identity-based. I am the type of person who moves their body every day. The behavior follows from the self-conception rather than from the goal or the schedule. And Clear's argument for why this is more durable is sound. Identity-consistent behavior doesn't require ongoing motivation because it's not tied to an outcome. It's just what you are. Runners run. That's not a decision they make each morning. It's an expression of who they are. This is a genuinely powerful framework. It's also the thing that makes the reset cycle more damaging than most people realize. The Sunday recommitment almost always contains an identity claim. It's rarely stated explicitly, it doesn't need to be. It lives underneath the plan. This is the week I get serious. This is the week I stop being the person who starts and stops and finally become the person who follows through. The list of habits is almost secondary. What the person is really doing on Sunday night is deciding who they're going to be starting Monday. That identity claim feels like the most powerful fuel available. For men who have been running this cycle for years, who have tried the systems and read the books and still find themselves back at the same starting line, the identity claim is often the last thing that makes trying again feel worth it. If I can just decide hard enough who I'm going to be, maybe this time the behavior will follow. But watch what happens when the system collapses on Thursday. It doesn't just feel like a behavioral failure. It doesn't feel like I missed 2 workouts this week. It feels like I decided on Sunday who I was going to be, and by Thursday, I proved that I'm not that person. That's an identity failure. That's evidence, and it feels like evidence, about who you fundamentally are, not what you did this week. Who you are. This is a synthesis. Clear doesn't map his identity framework onto the reset cycle this way, but the mechanism follows directly from his model. Identity claims that precede the structural foundation don't just fail, they generate failure narratives that are more damaging than the behavioral failure they're attached to. And those failure narratives are extremely effective fuel for the next reset cycle, because now you have something to redeem. The identity needs to be reclaimed, which makes Sunday feel not just attractive, but necessary. Clear also makes a point about what he calls never missing twice, the principle that missing once is an accident, but missing twice is the beginning of a new habit, the habit of not doing it. This is accurate and useful, but the reset cycle represents something beyond missing twice. It represents a weekly ritual of missing, resetting, missing, resetting, so deeply encoded that the reset itself has become the habit. The thing the brain has learned to do when the system breaks is not to continue, it's to wait for Sunday. The solution here is not to stop making identity claims. Clear is right that identity is a powerful lever. The solution is to stop leading with the identity claim before the structural foundation exists to support it. An identity claim with no design underneath it doesn't build the identity, it just raises the stakes on each subsequent failure. Everything up to this point has been diagnosis. The reward lands at recommitment instead of continuation. The restart overloads ability every single time. The identity claim raises the failure stakes without providing structural support. Three separate mechanisms, all pointing in the same direction, all reinforcing each other. That's why the loop is so durable. You're not fighting one thing, you're fighting three things that work together. The system that breaks this loop doesn't address motivation. It doesn't ask you to want it more, or believe in it more, or commit more seriously on Sunday. It addresses the three structural failures directly, in sequence, 3 shifts. This is what the frameworks across Clear, Duhigg, and Fogg converge on when you stop asking how to stay motivated and start asking where the design is failing. Shift 1. Shrink re-entry. When the cycle breaks, and it will break because disruption is not a sign of failure, it's a feature of real life, the re-entry behavior has to be smaller than feels justified. Not a scaled-back version of the full system, not half the workouts. One behavior, the one that, if it were running consistently, would matter most to you. Just that one. And then Fogg's instruction, which is the part that will feel almost insulting until you understand what it's doing. Make it tiny, absurdly, almost insultingly tiny. Not, I'll do a 20-minute workout. I'll put on my workout clothes. Not, I'll meditate for 10 minutes. I'll sit in the chair I meditate in. Not, I'll work on the project for an hour. I'll open the document. Fogg calls these tiny habits, and his argument is not that tiny is a starting point you'll eventually scale up from. His argument is that tiny is the mechanism. Here's why it works specifically for the reset cycle. When you shrink re-entry to something that requires almost no ability, you remove the convergence problem from Fogg's behavior model. Ability is no longer a variable. The behavior is so small that motivation doesn't need to be high to execute it. The prompt, the anchor, which we'll get to in a moment, is all that's required, which means the behavior can happen on Wednesday when motivation is at baseline. It can happen on Saturday when you're tired. It can happen the day after the system broke without requiring a reset. Fogg's anchor method is essential here. He doesn't recommend time-based cues for tiny habits. I'll do this at 7 a.m. because time is an abstract prompt that's easy to miss or ignore. He recommends anchoring the new behavior to an existing behavior, something you already do automatically every day without thinking about it. After I pour my morning coffee, I will sit in the meditation chair. After I take off my work shoes, I will put on my workout clothes. The anchor is already running automatically. You're piggybacking the new behavior onto something the basal ganglia is already handling. This solves the prompt problem from the behavior model, and it addresses what Duhigg identifies as the cue structure of the habit loop. The cue is no longer Sunday evening, the trigger for the reset cycle. The cue is the anchor behavior, which fires daily. The loop starts running on a daily cadence instead of a weekly one, which means there's no 7-day gap in which the reset can become attractive. Shift 2. Move the reward. This is the most important shift and the one most people skip entirely. Duhigg's research establishes that the reward drives the loop. The cue and the routine are just the path to the reward. If the reward stays attached to the Sunday recommitment, the loop continues to run towards Sunday. To break the loop, the reward has to move, off the decision to start and onto the act of continuing. Fogg's solution to this is what he calls celebration, and it sounds trivial until you understand the neurological mechanism. Fogg argues, and this is based on his own research as well as the broader neuroscience of habit formation, that what wires a behavior into the brain is not repetition alone. It's the positive emotion that immediately follows the behavior. The feeling of success at the moment of completion is what signals to the brain that this behavior is worth encoding. The instruction is this. At the moment you complete the tiny behavior, the second you put on the workout clothes, the second you sit in the meditation chair, the second you open the document, you generate a genuine positive emotional response. Not elaborate, not performative, something real and immediate. A quiet yes, a fist pump, whatever is authentic to you. The specific form doesn't matter, the emotional reality does. Fogg is careful to distinguish this from external rewards, checking a box, logging a streak, telling someone about it. Those can work, but they're not the mechanism. The mechanism is the internal emotional response at the moment of completion. That's the signal the brain uses to decide whether to encode the behavior. What you are doing with this practice across repetitions is slowly relocating the reward. Each time you execute the tiny behavior and generate the positive response, you are training your brain that the reward lives in the doing, in the continuation, rather than in the Sunday resolution. This doesn't happen in a week. It happens across 20, 30, 50 repetitions. But each repetition shifts the neurological balance slightly. Over time, the clean slate feeling on Sunday becomes less compelling because the reward is no longer exclusively located there. It's also available Tuesday morning when you put on your workout clothes. It's available Thursday afternoon when you open the document. The loop doesn't disappear. Loops don't disappear. Duhigg is clear on this. What changes is what the loop is running toward. You are redesigning the reward structure, which is the only intervention that actually changes where the loop points. Shift 3. Never restart. Continue. The third shift is partly language and partly architecture, and the two are not separable. Clear's never miss twice principle is worth taking seriously, but the framing still centers the failure. Don't miss twice is organized around the idea of missing. The gap is still the reference point. The instruction that breaks the reset cycle at the structural level is different, and it follows from what Clear establishes about systems being more important than goals. You don't restart, you continue. When Wednesday happens and the workout didn't, you continue Thursday, not with a modified plan, not with a recommitment, not with a new list. You execute the same tiny anchor behavior you've been executing, the same one. No ceremony, no Sunday ritual, no acknowledgement that anything broke. You continue. This removes what Duhigg would identify as the cue for the reset routine. The reset routine is triggered by the feeling that the system has failed and needs to be relaunched. If the system is always in progress, always continuable from wherever it was last executed, then that cue never fires. There's nothing to reset. There's only the next repetition. This also does something important to the identity mechanism Clear describes. The identity claim stops being future tense, I'm going to be the person who follows through, and becomes present tense, I'm the person who continues. That claim is available every time you execute the anchor behavior. You don't need a clean week to make it. You don't need to have been consistent since Monday. You need the next rep. Clear's research on habit formation and identity shows that identity is built through accumulated evidence. Each small action is a vote for the type of person you're becoming. The reset cycle produces almost no votes because the behavior collapses midweek, and the Sunday recommitment, while emotionally intense, doesn't count as evidence of the identity you're trying to build. It counts as evidence of the reset pattern. Continuing from Wednesday's failure on Thursday morning with the same tiny anchor behavior, no drama, no restart, that counts. That is a vote. Not for the person who never misses, for the person who continues. That identity is actually available to you right now, regardless of how last week went. It only requires the next repetition. 3 shifts. Shrink re-entry so ability stops being the variable that collapses the system. Move the reward off the Sunday resolution and on to the daily continuation. Never restart. Continue from wherever you stopped. No ceremony, no clean slate required. None of these shifts require more motivation. All of them require design. That's the distinction that matters. The Sunday reset has been running long enough that it probably feels like a personality trait by now, like something about who you are rather than something about the system you've been using. It isn't. It's a reward loop, specifically engineered, accidentally, without your input, to deliver a real neurological payoff at the moment of recommitment rather than the moment of continuation. Duhigg's research is clear on this. The loop runs because the reward is real. You have not been failing at discipline. You have been succeeding at chasing a reward that is located in exactly the wrong place. Fogg spent 20 years studying motivation before concluding that it was the wrong variable to optimize for. The system you've been building keeps collapsing midweek because it was architected for peak motivation, which only exists on Sunday night. That's not a character flaw. It's a design flaw. Design flaws have design solutions. And Clear's framework on identity is right. The long lever is who you are, not what you're trying to achieve. But identity is built through accumulated evidence. The Sunday recommitment doesn't build the identity, it builds the reset pattern. The tiny continuation on Thursday morning, no drama, no restart, just the next rep, that builds the identity. One vote at a time. Tonight, not Monday, tonight, do one thing. Identify the single behavior from the last reset cycle that matters most, not the full system, one behavior. Then find the version of that behavior that is so small it almost doesn't count. The version that takes under 2 minutes, attached to something you already do automatically every day. Write it down in this format. After I do X, I will do Y. That's the anchor. That's where the continuity architecture starts. Not Sunday, not Monday, tonight. The loop you've been running is not a life sentence. It's a structural problem. And structural problems, unlike character problems, can be fixed.